We have to hold the paradox of our unique expression and not allow it to degenerate into polarization, because paradise is paradox. That's what paradise is. It's paradox. It's the ability to hold the fullness of contradiction and not have it become a degenerative polarization, but actually a fructifying, synergistic emergence of a new wholeness, a new story, a new paradox. So wow, that's what we're engaged in here. We have a huge summer coming up. I mean, we're doing our 10th annual intensive in response to existential risk, in response to catastrophic risk, in response to a world that's filled with outrageous pain and outrageous beauty, but that for the first time in human history, we could have no future. And we're standing in this moment facing what Robert K. Lifton, the eminent scholar, calls facing apocalypse, meaning we refuse to turn away. We actually take into our very being the experience of there being no future, but not in a way which shatters us, but in a way which enlivens us and calls us to be the voice of the future in the now, and to do everything in our power as evolution moves in us to actually change the vector of history. And we change the vector of history by telling a new story. That's what happened in the Renaissance as the pre-modern period was breaking down and the Black Death swept Europe. The Renaissance was indeed a time between worlds and a time between stories. We've been saying for 5 years here at One Mountain, and for another 5 years before, as we started the center, myself and Ken Wilbur and Lori Galperin and Christina Kincaid and Mariana Kaplan, and we're joined by Claire and Shahat, right, and Tom, right, and Sean and Victoria, and right, so many of us came together, right, John Mackey, right, to create, right, this space, Michael Beckwith, right, to create this space that we call the Center for Integral Wisdom. Daniel Schmachtenberger, right, of course, our co-president Zach Stein, right, Carrie Kish, right, the list goes on, right, and we've been joined by new powerful groups of human beings, right, who you're going to hear a lot from this summer as they lead some of the One Mountains, right. We heard today David and Tahaley. We're going to hear David, actually. We're about to hear David and Krista and Jacqueline and Jamie and Benjamin, right, and Terry Nelson from the very, very beginning, right. What have we been doing? We've been engaged in this response to existential risk, right, to what we began calling in 2011 the second shock of existence. Right, the first shock of existence is the experience of the human being, not the biological experience, but the existential experience of death. That death actually lurks, and that a life ends. And while there's continuity of consciousness, and we've talked about that profoundly, and that's a huge topic, but there's also, not as a bug, but as a feature in the system, an experience of death, and that's shocking. And that's the first shock of existence. The death of the human being. And the second shock of existence, which we began talking about in 2011, and after I gave a series of talks at Vinwadi, where Shahati and her partner Ted, right, organized a community for 30, 40 years, and Mauk, who studied with me and studied for several decades with Ted, right, Mauk came to a series of talks we gave on unique self as a response to existential risk, and Mauk wrote a little book called Unique Self and the Second Shock of Existence. And the second shock of existence is the experience not of the death of the individual human being, but of the potential death of humanity. And the general response to that is to look away. And when I started talking about a decade ago that the systems will actually break down and fail because the structure is such, the source code is such, not the surface. On the desktop, it all looks fine. But if you go into the source code, the civilizational source code, the civilizational source code, you actually realize that the source code itself is broken in certain key segments of the source code text. And if we don't actually evolve the source code, if we don't engage in what we do here at One Mountain in evolutionary sense making, or what we might also call source code conversations, but not just conversations of the mind, conversations of the body, conversations of the heart, embodied conversations, right? If we don't engage in source code conversations, if we don't do evolutionary sense making that leads to an evolution of the source code, then the vector of the distorted plot line of reality, right? The intentional plot lines, the inherent plot lines of reality have been hijacked by evolution that has stalled. There's this huge gap between interior technologies and exterior technologies. And when evolution stalls and exterior technologies exponentialize, weaponized exterior technologies exponentialize, with the capacity not through a nuclear bomb that requires state power to enact it, but actually through any number of forms of organized destruction through various kinds of weaponized systems, which form certain forms of existential risk, or the kind of existential risk which is not about the death of humanity, but the death of our humanity. There's two forms of existential risk, the death of humanity and the death of our humanity. We've been talking about that for quite a few years here. And we've been working to actually do the one ninja move, right? The gorgeous, beautiful, sacred imperative of our time, which is actually to rewrite the source code. And that's what Da Vinci and his cohorts did in the Renaissance. Marcello Ficinio, right? And the whole gang of the Renaissance, which, as we pointed out time and again, didn't have more than 1,000 people in it. This inner group of people who came together and said, we're going to actually rewrite the source code. We're going to participate in the evolution of love. We're ready to play a larger game and to participate in the evolution of love. And Barbara Marx Hubbard, right, played a key role, right, in articulating particular dimensions, particularly in championing an idea developed by Julian Huxley that actually appears already in a number of the places in interior sciences, right, that Charles Sanders Peirce articulated in a very beautiful way in an essay called Evolutionary Love. Barbara picked up not on the evolutionary love side, right, that's really where I spend my time and energy. Barbara picked up on the notion of conscious evolution and really shared that idea very powerfully in the world for decades, and organized networks and syncons, right, conversations and conferences to organize synergistic convergence, to connect what's working worldwide, right, and to advocate for a kind of social synergy, right, to locate what's working worldwide already in all the sectors of civilization, what Barbara called the wheel of co-creation, right? Incredibly important. And then Barbara and I came together and we rewrote the wheel of co-creation. We called it Wheel of Co-Creation 2.0. And the rewriting of that wheel was in order to address certain key pieces that were missing in the initial explosion of beauty and creativity, which Barbara did, which was wheel one, number one, and number two, to actually address, right, certain essential broken parts of the source code that were part of the early transhumanist movement, which inspired Barbara, which she adopted, and which were part of the early evolutionary spirituality movement, right, which inspired Barbara, and she both adopted and contributed to in enormous ways. And that's what our conversation was about last week. And I hope that we modeled how we have a conversation with mad love and honor for Barbara and who she was and her goodness and her contribution and the depth of it. And there's no one who I'm sure was more ecstatic at last week's One Mountain than Barbara. And what prompted the conversation last week was a series of, public critiques of Barbara, which had two kinds of information. Let me say it a little more clearly. One kind of information was just distorted and false. It characterized, for example, institutions like HeartMath, as participating in some global conspiracy, right, to oppress the masses and lure them, right, into a kind of torporitic slumber, into a kind of docile sleep. So kind of the agents of the Great Reset, right, could take over. That, of course, has nothing to do with what HeartMath is. HeartMath is an excellent institution. I had one set of extensive conversations with one party who was, a key figure there, but I've never been associated with them. Quite a few of my friends were in different places. They've done fantastic and beautiful work, and they have nothing to do, right, with how they were described, for example, in one of those posts critiquing Barbara. So in other words, there's an enormous amount of information in those posts that are linked together to kind of create a conspiratorial, right, thread, when in fact, right, it's simply not true. It simply doesn't characterize, right, the truth in any sense, shape, or form. That's number one. But number two, there was in those, those conversations, a thread of quotations from Barbara and from Desjardins and from Buckminster Fuller, right, which, particularly from Barbara, which were chilling. Now, I don't have my library with me at the moment. Barbara left me when she passed, all of her books. So I could have checked this. I don't have my library with me, so I can't check the context of the quotes right now. Right, so I haven't been able to do that. But the quotes in and of themselves, right, were chilling. Right, and they talked about, right, a kind of, what I would call a kind of Thanos possibility. Right, and by a Thanos possibility, what I mean is, if I can hark back to a public culture text, The Avengers, out of Marvel Studios, which in 2018 and 19, right, described a world facing existential risk, right? The League of Superheroes, the Avengers, don't know what to do, and one person kind of faces apocalypse. His name is Thanos, and Thanos is both the villain of the story, and he's the villain because he makes a decision to actually, in one instant, painlessly wipe out half of humanity in order to save the other half, right? Which is a shocking moral decision, a reprehensible moral decision for many, many, many reasons, because Thanos had actually made the decision that this was the only thing to do. He felt that no one else had the courage, right, to look directly at the apocalypse and make the hard decision. However, now stay close with me, if you notice when you watch the movie, Thanos is not your classical villain. Everyone with me? Thanos is not your classical villain in any way, right? We see Thanos as this much more complex figure, and that's who he's painted by Marvel Studios, making these hard decisions. Thanos' own home planet is destroyed because the leadership of Thanos' planet refuses to directly face existential risk. And so everyone dies of starvation. And Thanos grows up with that trauma, and he commits not to allow that trauma to be repeated, right, on a galactic level. Now, it's not by accident that this is the scene in popular culture in 2018 and 2019, right before COVID. And of course, the reviewers of the Avenger movies kind of missed this. Or they characterized Thanos as a villain and didn't understand the complexity of the Thanos character. And if we were doing an analysis of that movie, I would walk through 5 or 6 scenes where Thanos appears as a transhumanist, right? He appears as an early transhumanist, right, who's committed to some form of eugenics, some form of population control, right, in order to save humanity, right, from itself. And so again, Thanos is this very complex figure, right? At the opening of the second Avengers movie, we see him, barefoot in his little cabin. He didn't go live in a palace after he destroyed half of the world. He lives in a little cabin. He's eating, a rice bowl, probably from some good San Francisco restaurant, kind of completely healthy, a tuna ahi tuna poke bowl maybe, right? And he's watching the sunset and he's meditating, right? So he has this transhumanist cast to him. He's saving the world, but he's making decisions that from an ordinary perspective are more morally reprehensible, and in fact they are morally reprehensible. The problem is that the Avengers, who all challenge him, don't know how to articulate what's wrong with what he did. Why is he wrong? Why is Thanos wrong? So the Avengers, when they try and confront Thanos, Thanos speaks with great articulation and clarity, right, and moral purpose and passion, and the Avengers are filled with passion, but no moral clarity. They're not sure. They know he's wrong, and they're right, he's wrong. And to be clear, Thanos is wrong. Thanos is a dark shadow of versions of evolutionary spirituality and versions of transhumanism. And it's those versions that Barbara, right, in her early days apparently echoed. I caught fragrances of this when Barbara and I spoke ourselves, and we had fierce arguments, and Barbara went through a great evolutionary transformation and shifted her position and merged, kind of, if you will, as Barbara and I went through our process of being evolutionary partners and evolutionary wholemates, meaning we're working together for the sake of the whole. We're actually not joining genes, but joining genius. She went through a process of actually abandoning those early positions, but I myself wasn't even aware of the full weight of them until I researched and looked up, right, some of the citations, right, that appeared in a number of these conversations. And they are chilling. And there are citations from Teilhard de Chardin that are chilling. And that was the nature of the conversation then. And that's very important to understand, right? In mainstream society, there was a mainstream moral society conversation about eugenics, about certain transhumanist possibilities. It's a big deal. And there was an inability then in society to challenge them. In the end, they got challenged because we realized, right, that they lead to things like Nazism. Nazism actually cited early eugenics, right, as a justification. And Nazism is and was a shadow form, an extreme shadow form of evolutionary spirituality. That's absolutely true. And of course, Yuval Harari in his book Homo Deus is not incorrect as a historian in characterizing, right, some of the most grotesque movements in human history, particularly in their transhumanist 20th, 19th, and 20th century forms, as formulations of, distorted formulations of evolutionary spirituality. Now, Harari doesn't exactly present them as distorted formulations. He just presents them as formulations of evolutionary spirituality. They're actually distorted formulations. They're dark shadows of evolutionary spirituality, dark shadows of transhumanism that we need to evolve beyond. But evolutionary spirituality itself is enormously important. And a cogent version of evolutionary spirituality is enormously important. And so we need to actually radically reject the dark shadow, which is the Thanos option. And the Avengers want to do that in that Avengers movie, but they don't quite know how to do it. Why? Because they're lacking a grammar of value which can adequately and potently and compellingly challenge Thanos. Because the Avengers are emergent from Marvel Studios, and Marvel Studios is a postmodern expression, right, of media culture, which is afraid to claim objective value, intrinsic value, which is afraid to claim what we call first principles and first values embedded in a story of value. And when you don't have first principles and first values embedded in a story of value, you actually don't know how to challenge Thanos. And so the Avengers, and that's the script writers, right, of Marvel Studios making the Avengers movies, know Thanos is wrong. They can feel it in their bodies, and yet they paint Thanos as a kind of almost hero and don't actually know how to write a script, right, for the Avengers in their conversations with Thanos. And all they're able to say is, that's madness. But why is it madness, he says, right? You don't know it's going to go that way, right? You can't make that decision. It's not yours to make. Now, those are all true. It is madness, right? But why, right? And if you can't actually, right, articulate, right, first values and first principles, you can't actually arouse astonishment and outrage. Does that make sense, everyone? Astonishment and outrage is aroused in response to the obvious violation of first principles and first values. That's why when we saw George Floyd, right, with Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck for 9 minutes, in that complex, tragic story, we were beyond outraged and we poured into the streets, right? Because we saw an obvious violation of value that pierced the slumber of the postmodern moment and aroused appropriate outrage. And it's why in the first weeks of the Ukrainian war, when the media flooded our eyes with images of moral outrage, right, we were blown out of our minds, and we stood and we talked and we engaged. Now notice, friends, I want you to notice this. Take a look at the movie Wag the Dog, right? Notice, for a set of reasons, the media has actually in many ways looked away from the Ukraine. Right? How many of you thought about the Ukraine in an active way in the last 2 weeks? Maybe a little bit, not much. But the Ukraine is in the middle of the worst throes of war right now. I'm tracking it very closely. How many people thought about the Ukraine as much in the last 2 weeks as they did, right, in the first 6 weeks of the war? Why? Because a set of decisions in the media establishment has moved your attention. You don't even realize it happened. So bracket that. That's a very, very important issue. Let's stay focused. Let's stay really focused. It's a big deal. So what we talked about last week was, and where we placed our attention, and it's a place that people don't place their attention, we placed our attention on the shadows of transhumanism, the shadows of evolutionary spirituality, not to dismiss them, and those two, by the way, are not collapsible. They overlapped with each other, but I don't want to collapse evolutionary spirituality and transhumanism, although they have lots of intersecting vectors. But we talked about their shadows, right? But not in order to dismiss them, but in order to point out that actually there was some correctness in that critique of Barbara, which needs to be acknowledged. But that acknowledgement has to fully understand that Barbara was operating right in that context. It was a context in which, right, was a postmodern context, which there was an inability to articulate first values and first principles, in which a Thanos kind of emergence was actually in many, many conversations around the world. And by the way, those conversations are still taking place around the world. There's still a strong transhumanist movement that's actually still having those Thanos conversations. That's why Thanos appeared as an ambivalent and complex figure in a 2018 and 2019 Avengers movie. Okay? But we also wanted to point out last week that Barbara herself, and that was really the essence of our meeting at the Center for Integral Wisdom, right? We had an enormously deep set of, tens and tens and tens and hundreds of conversations. Barbara evolved her position. And of course, the people that wrote that post ignored, 130 or 40 weeks of One Mountain, in which Barbara's position, as Barbara and I integrated together, had clearly evolved. Clearly evolved. All of that was completely ignored. There's at least, in One Mountain, at least 130, 140 posts in the public space that show a very, very clear, unmistakable transformation and evolution of Barbara's own position. All of that material was completely ignored, because that's what happens when you cherry pick sources to demonize someone in order to kind of argue for a conspiratorial narrative, right, which actually, right, has its own egoic agenda, which actually has its own, right, set of vectors. So I really want to just honor Barbara in that way. It's what I wanted to do last week, and I want to deepen it this week. So wow, that was a big introduction. And you understand, we're doing this just for this week and next week, because this is wildly important. So I want to turn to David, right, to resonate our code, and thank Christina Amelon for a beautiful and elegant Dharma recapitulation. David's going to resonate the code, and then if I can, just for a few minutes, I want to go part 2 on what the shadow of evolutionary spirituality is and how we can evolve it. I also want to just, if I can, and he's a peer and does not require my commendation, so I mean this not in a condescending way, but in a brother way, but I'm really just also honor Andrew Cohen. Andrew and I, I mentioned last week, and we've exchanged on this, via WhatsApp. Andrew and I had a very big exchange on this, back in 2005 and, in 2006, Andrew wrote a book called Evolutionary Enlightenment. I wrote a book called Self, Two Models of Self and Evolutionary Mysticism and Why They Matter. Right? That book was a critique of evolutionary enlightenment and what I thought were very, very clear flaws or shadows in the position of evolutionary spirituality. Right? Andrew has since, and Andrew and I have had many deep conversations, dramatically, right, I believe, evolved his position. He can speak for himself. He's perfectly beautiful and capable of doing that. But I welcome anyone to read that conversation. You can actually get the book Evolutionary Enlightenment, which is Andrew's book, which I think is, by the way, a great book. And you can get, my book, Your Unique Self, but particularly this book, Self. Maybe someone can put it in the chat box. Self, Two Models of Evolutionary Mysticism, which compares my unique self model with Andrew's authentic self model and critiques, right, the book Evolutionary Enlightenment in one particular regard. And I think not only has Andrew's position dramatically evolved in this respect, and I think he took the critique seriously, but of course in other areas, Andrew's impacted me because we engage as brothers in a kind of dharma combat, right? But it's a combat in which we're loving each other, which we're honoring each other as peers, right? And we want to impact each other. That's what an evolutionary conversation is. An evolutionary conversation is not egos jousting in the public sphere in order to score points for their separate self craving, right? Base, right? Mad ego. An evolutionary conversation is we want to impact each other. We want to transform together. And just as Andrew, right, allowed himself to be impacted, I think, and moved in a very deep way by Self and by many of our conversations. He actually shared that with me in phone conversations. There were dimensions of evolutionary spirituality and phrases that Andrew used. Like there's a particular phrase that Andrew used called ecstatic urgency, which I love and I've adopted and I adduce it, and cite Andrew. And then there were very particular formulations of evolutionary spirituality that went through Andrew's prism and his, unique, right, experience, right, that impacted on me. And I'm delighted to say that, right? That's what we're supposed to do. And what Andrew and I actually just began doing a year and a half ago, but we just started phase 2, is we started a new public conversation on evolutionary spirituality. We've done 2 conversations, and we've both spent a good deal of our lives trying to lay down different core tenets of evolutionary spirituality. And now we're coming together in a public conversation, right, to share, right, what we've done these last 20 years in this particular domain, right, and to evolve it further to be able to articulate it clearly. And that's how we need to have conversations. And can you imagine if the pro-life, right, and pro-choice people got together and had those kind of conversations? Can you imagine if the best of the Republican Party, right, like George Will, right, all of the great figures in the Republican Party, right, throughout the ages, right, got together with the best of the Democratic Party in order to synergize, like Jack Kennedy and Richard Nixon did, right, in the late 50s, even into the early 60s, even after their presidential debate, they remained close friends, as they should be, because they knew that they were each holding a piece of the puzzle, and that the puzzle only becomes whole when we love each other, when we become wholemates. That's the way it's supposed to happen, right? And we're so afraid to have a conversation. But an evolutionary conversation is when we're loving each other madly, and we're holding together this passion for truth, passion for a deeper understanding, passion for insight, right? The people that, just blow my heart open are people that can come and say, hey, Marc, right, you said it this way, right? We've read the Dharma, we're in, but here's one dimension where I think there's one source that you could have taken into account, or you could have looked at it this way and you missed, right? But not if they just claim it, but if they actually go deep and they're fully engaged, right? And they bring, right, to my attention, they place my attention on something that I missed, right? Or even they correct something, right, that I've held for 25 years, but they show me a deeper way of understanding that, not because they claim it, because they actually do the work, right? That blows my heart open. I fall madly in love with that person, right? That's how we have to have conversations. We have to hold the paradox of our unique expression and not allow it to degenerate into polarization, right? Because paradise is paradox. That's what paradise is. It's paradox. It's the ability to hold the fullness of contradiction and not have it become a degenerative polarization, but actually a fructifying, synergistic emergence of a new wholeness, a new story, right? A new paradox. So, wow, that's what we're engaged in here. And so last week and this week, we're just putting some energy, right, and trying to model what these kind of conversations need to be like, right? And what does it mean? And it's a very different model than the kind of posts you see, right, that kind of try and let me string together a bunch of material, let me take it out of context, right? Let me not actually check and investigate, right? And actually paint a full picture and allow for evolution, right? That's an ego self. That's an ego self game, right? And at the same time, even when I read people engaged in that ego self game, if they make a point that's legitimate, I want to open my heart and say, wow, that's right. That's right. Well, that's a really good point. That critique was correct. And since Barbara wasn't here to speak for herself, and she asked me when she passed to hold this together with her, so I just in deep, deep love, respect, and honor for Barbara, right, took the liberty, because I've had hundreds of conversations with her about this, of responding. And part of the response was, yes, you're right. You're right. I made a mistake there. That was a mistake. It was actually a tragic mistake. And I didn't understand that. And now I do, right? And I've evolved my position, right? Wow. So David, take us into the code, and just madly delighted to be together with everyone, and just honored, right, to be able to together as a unique self symphony honor Barbara, right, and model what a different kind of conversation looks like. I turn with great delight to David.
That which unites us is far greater than that which divides us. We are united in a shared story of value. That does not make us perfect expressions of that value. We are all imperfect vessels for the light, the holy and broken hallelujahs. We must move beyond demonization to daemonization. It's only the loss of daemon that turns us into demon. When we are not inside the circle together, we place others outside the circle as a way of pretending that we're inside. Only a shared story based on first values and first principles serves as the ground for a global ethos, for a global civilization. So I'll just resonate one more time because it's such a powerful code. That which unites us is far greater than that which divides us. We are united in a shared story of value. That does not make us perfect expressions of that value. We are all imperfect vessels for the light, the holy and broken hallelujahs. We must move beyond demonization to daemonization. It's only the loss of daemon that turns us into demon. When we are not inside the circle together, we place others outside the circle as a way of pretending that we are on the inside. It's only a shared story based on first values and first principles that serves as a ground for the global ethos, for a global civilization. So with that, I turn my word back to you.
Gorgeous. Thank you. Thank you, David. Beautiful, right? Beautiful. And by the way, we're all in light shirts this week. We're often in black shirts. This is a light shirt week. Okay. So David's got white. Oh my God. Right? Beautiful. David, what a gorgeous code. And there's so much to say about the code, but I really just want to have this week, with permission, the code as a kind of general context, right? Holding Barbara, beyond the inappropriate demonization, right? But as daemon, right? And it's the beautiful sense of charism. And charism means, right? Charisma means divinity flowing through. And the beautiful divinity that flows and flowed through Barbara, right? That grounds, right, this one mountain. I just want to share one more thing. Someone called me who's very, very wonderful human being, right? Who's on our board, right? And, and said, I think we need to kind of really distance from Barbara, because of, there was these critiques, right? And my response to that, right, with lots of love, well, it's expletive deleted. And I've made a promise to my dear friend Oriana that there's no expletive deleted, right, in one mountain. So I won't tell you what I said, right? But my point is, I can barely get the words out. People are so afraid in the internet culture, right? They're so afraid. And there's so much subtle McCarthyism, right? So if someone's attacked, or if there's a move to kind of cancel someone, what you got to do is you've got to kind of back off of them so you don't get tainted with that attack. Right? That is not the way we love in the world. That is not who we are. Right? I am so wildly proud, right, that Barbara is my evolutionary partner and our evolutionary partner, and that she grounded, right, and founded One Mountain, Many Paths with us. Right? And the fact that Barbara made a set of early transhumanist mistakes, in particular articulations, which I think were tragic, right, doesn't change that one iota, right, at all. Not one iota. And I'm going to tell you something else. When in 2028, right, the dossier on Martin Luther King, right, is revealed, it's when it's going to be made public, at which time, if you've tracked this issue, which I have, right, an enormous amount of very complicated personal material about Martin Luther King is probably going to emerge. I'm not going to demonize Martin Luther King, because Martin Luther King made a huge contribution, which was important, which was holy, and purity moved in his heart, and love moved him, and he was a broken vessel for the light. Because we're all, in some sense, holy and broken. Hallelujahs. We're all imperfect vessels for the light. And there's not a person alive, right, who has greatness in them that hasn't made mistakes that are real. Now, that's a very, very big deal. Right? A person gets to make a mistake and then gets to correct that mistake and gets to transform. Right? And because there's an entire literature critiquing Martin Luther King on very, very powerful issues that are at the center of Me Too and are at the center of honoring the feminine, it doesn't mean that we dismiss Martin Luther King, right, as a critical leader and we cancel him. Right? That's not what we do. That's a very, very, very big deal. And it's very easy also to misunderstand how we gather information. We don't gather information in internet posts, right, which don't actually allow for genuine conversation and genuine truth searching. But you've got to actually look at, how are you gathering information? Are you gathering information with an open heart? Are you open to receiving new information? Are you open to being impacted? Are you open to revising your position? Are you open to checking sources? Or are you open to actually watching what your cognitive biases are, which move you to want to agree with a particular position? Are you open to check where you're virtue or vice signaling, right, in order to actually, right, gain, right, the approval of the crowd? You've got to do all of that in order to be and to engage in a source code conversation, in order to do evolutionary sense making. And we need to actually begin to understand that how we gather information and how we make judgments was one of the great momentous leaps, right, and breakthroughs of evolutionary love in modernity. And what's happening in postmodernity, and put the postmodern mind, I want to give you a big sentence if I can with permission, the exteriorization of the postmodern mind is the internet. Meaning the postmodern mind says there's no narrative, there's no story, right? There's no larger plot line. So for example, one of the things that the editor, Kevin Kelly, who was representing the postmodern movement, argued is that we should no longer have books with authors, but actually all of the information should be available. You just search it on the web, right? Not associated with an author, not associated with a particular book. In other words, the undermining of storyline, right? We no longer hold in our memory, right, long and complex threads of information, because we've actually outsourced memory itself to the internet. And when we read on the internet, we no longer stay in the deep thread of a plot line because we're hyperlinking all the time, right? We no longer read, right, as was described by Hawthorne, right? Hawthorne in his Sleepy Hollow, where he describes sitting, against an oak tree and just going deep into reading. We don't do that anymore. Right? We actually search around on the internet. My beloved Christina described to me the difference between her experience, and she had in her apartment in New York a wall filled with books, and she describes her experience when she reads and when she's scrolling on her phone. And she started doing a phone fast in order to come back to kind of straight reading, so you can actually drop inside of the inside as you read, and you allow a storyline to enter you, and you allow information, you begin to check the information. What we do today when we're scrolling, right, we're actually not engaged in reading. We're not engaged in a plot line. We're not actually able to organize information in our minds. We're jumping from source to source. We're hyperlinking. There's no narrative. There's no storyline. There's no plot line. And what we read is usually a particular vector or bubble of one of the sides in the propaganda wars, right? That are all saying something completely consistent, that never disagree with each other within that vector, which is how you know it's a vector of propaganda. Like, wow, right? That's not how we do it. That's not how we form judgments, right? So to those, right, in my immediate circle who said, wow, right, Barbara got a little critiqued, we need to back off, and maybe you shouldn't be publishing these books with Barbara. Are you kidding? Are you kidding, my friends, my beloveds? Right, we're going to embrace Barbara and honor her more than ever before, right? Because we refuse to be hijacked, right, by a kind of techno-feudalist, kind of neoliberal, right, postmodern hijacking, right, of energy. In the same way, we're not going to be hijacked by kind of a Trumpian, right, corrupt narrative. We're not going to be hijacked by corrupt narratives right, on any side of the spectrum. We're going to look at every issue. We're going to look at it deeply, right? We're going to do sense making together. We're going to gather contradictory opinions. We're going to check sources. We're going to check our heart and our body. And then we're not just going to talk softly, we'll talk fiercely. But we're going to integrate, we're going to synergize, we're going to get to new holes. And that's what we need to do all the time. But I want to just hit one issue with you, right, in terms of the kind of mistake of early evolutionary spirituality and transhumanism. And I want to see if we can kind of correct and evolve that mistake. Okay? And I want to do it, and I actually wrote, several pages of notes to myself this morning. We've gotten through the first 3 words, right? So I apologize for that. But as we move into the fall and we evolve the structure, we're going to be evolving the structure of One Mountain. I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about everything. But let me just hit one issue. And the issue is, let's call it the personal. The personal, Personal, the personal. So when Thanos says, in order to save half of humanity, I'm going to destroy half of humanity, what Thanos doesn't understand is what we would call the irreducible, infinite value of unique personhood. Huge. So for example, there's an entire literature which exists in the lineages of the great traditions, which asks the following question. If a city is being surrounded, attacked, and the attackers they're willing to actually leave the city if the people inside the city will actually give up, let's say, five people to be the sacrificial victims, or even one person to be the sacrificial victim of those who are attacking. So that's a major issue in the Hebrew lineage conversations, which revolves around actually a number of stories, right? Mythical stories that exist in the biblical canon, right? Do you save a city by giving up one person? And the general, this is a more complex issue, but the general vector of conversation is absolutely not. That's complicated. Absolutely not. That we actually don't make that kind of calculation with a human life. That there's actually irreducible dignity to unique personhood. Now, stay close with me. This is subtle. It's not simple. It's subtle. It's not simple. But of course, why is it not simple? Because we have something called war. Now, what's war? So I was sitting with, something in my eye, I apologize. I was sitting with the Dalai Lama, right, in Dharamsala, where he had invited me after an argument that I've told you guys about, at different times, right, to visit him. And we were talking about war. And he said to me, right, people think I'm a pacifist, right, that I'm against war. And he said, it's not true. I think there should be an army, there needs to be an army, because there are some issues that we can only handle in a world that has despotic, totalitarian dictatorships. We need to be able to, at times, respond with force. Now, I agree with the Dalai Lama, right, at this moment in history. To respond with force means we're willing to give up the lives of some young men, and in certain armies, young men and women, for the sake of keeping the larger whole safe. So it doesn't mean we never make a calculation. I want to be very careful about this. It's actually a very subtle issue that requires an enormous amount of attention. We do at times, right, make a calculation, right? And right? There are countries that have a draft, right, where someone's actually drafted. They don't actually even get to make a choice, right, about whether they participate in that war. Wow, that's not simple. What does it mean for my son, Eitan, and my son Yair, who are both commanders in special forces, right, in the Israeli army? That's how they did their army service. What does it mean for them to literally risk their lives to keep school buses safe in Israel, to keep them safe from blowing up? Why are they risking their lives? Well, because they're actually understanding themselves as part of the larger whole, and they're making a heroic decision that they were willing to risk their lives. So it's not that there's no conversation to be had. There is a conversation to be had. And it's got to be a subtle and careful conversation. But you can't, now here's the point, you can't have the conversation absent first principles and first values. In other words, if you don't understand, it's a subtle point, but it's everything. If you don't understand that every human life has infinite value, and that actually, in principle, it's worth giving up the entire city and not handing over one person. If you don't understand that in your body, if you don't understand the irreducible dignity of every human story, which is not just a separate self story, right? It's the cosmos story in person in that human being. And you don't know that that story has infinite value. It's precious beyond imagination. And that every smile and every gesture of love by that person and every right expression right of kindness and goodness and every creative moment and every right jot and tittle right of pain and anguish, right, that all of that matters infinitely and participates in the infinite field of person and meeting. If you don't get that, then you can't participate in a conversation about how you do trade-offs at the appropriate time. Because what you'll do is, right, as Stalin believed, as Mao believed, as Genghis Khan believed in his own way, what you'll basically do is you'll make a calculation which says, I'm willing to give up, at the drop of a hat, hundreds of thousands of people in order to accomplish my goal of whatever that goal is. Because I do a quick calculation, I do a transhumanist calculation, and I operate in order to save humanity. I'm willing to give up a lot of it because it's a natural, logical calculation. No, actually every human being is all of humanity. And all of humanity lives in every human being. We have to start from the premise of the irreducible value of uniqueness. Uniqueness as an ultimate value. The irreducible value of an individual life. Right, the irreducible value of the unique quality of intimacy that person right incarnates. If I'm not living in the field of value, and I'm not living in the field of first values and first principles, then there's no way to have the conversation. And does everyone understand that? That's huge. Now, clearly we can't have the full conversation in this moment in time. But what we know is that the second you make a move towards eugenics, what you're doing is you're actually solving the problem the easy way. The Thanos solution is actually the easy solution. And that's why, right, the Avengers understand, right, that Thanos is actually shortcutting. But they can't articulate why. He's shortcutting because, A, he doesn't have first principles and first values. Because he doesn't have first principles and first values, right, he actually goes for the logical shortcut solution. And the logical shortcut solution is, since there's not the irreducible dignity of every human life, and so what you do is in order to save half of humanity, right, you lose the rest of humanity. You do it in a way that's painless. But actually, there's many, many more creative possibilities on the table that Thanos has missed. And actually, our response to existential risk and our response to catastrophic risk is not to cull the herd. Right? It's not that evolution's not nice, as early transhumanists said. Evolution is actually the love story of the universe. And that's the big realization that Barbara came to as we studied together. Right? Evolution is the love story of the universe. And in the love story of the universe, right, every love story, every individual love story matters. And when I actually focus my love, I place my love's attention on a challenge, I get wildly creative. And that wild creativity is born of love. And that creativity allows me to generate both new exterior technologies, right? Which is why, for example, there was the great prediction in the late 1960s that there would be a famine, right, that would sweep the world, and the world would actually, right, essentially collapse, right, in exponentially unimaginable famines, and the exact opposite happened. And the reason the exact opposite happened is because there was a young scientist, right, in Mexico who developed a new way, right, of fertilizing soil, right, and working with soil and with crops that allowed for exponential increases, right, in the production of food. That's an exterior technological creative breakthrough. But we need to do something even deeper. We need to make breakthroughs in interior technologies. We need to change the very vector of the story itself, right? We need to actually tell a new story of value, of first values and first principles, and that new story of value will actually inform where we place our resources. Do you know, last sentence, do you know, friends, how important data science is in the world, right? To actually developing creative, impactful solutions for existential risk. Do you know, fact two, where most of data scientists are spending their time? None of them, virtually none of them, are spending their time actually engaging existential and catastrophic risk. Do you know where virtually all of the data scientists in the world are spending their time today, friends? Anybody? They're working for Google, right? They're working for Facebook. They're working for TikTok. They're working for Microsoft, right? They're working for Apple, which are for-profit companies that are hoarding, not even investing back into the market, unimaginable profits that most of them are not paying, right, any kind of normal taxation on. Some are not paying taxation at all because of legal loopholes, right? That financial resource is owned by Sergey Brin, $150 billion. Why does Sergey Brin need $150 billion? With all due respect, Sergey. And Sergey is actually a good friend of a close friend of mine. So Sergey, love you, man. But yo, man, what you thinking? Right? In other words, and Google is actually engaged in a process of exponential power and profit. And they've actually siphoned off all of the data scientists, so much so that universities today can't find professors of data science because no one wants the job. Because making a couple $100,000 a year at a university doesn't compare with the golden handcuffs, right, of the Google, Facebook, right, Twitter, TikTok, Microsoft, Oracle, or Apple package. So we've taken, for example, data science, which is a critical vector that we need to actually deploy in order to actually generate new possibilities of engaging catastrophic and existential risk. And we've actually siphoned off that critical creativity into a success 2.0, right, win-lose metrics, rivalrous conflict story. Let me actually make another $800,000 a year. And in order for me to succeed in my monadic separate self dissociated existence, which is actually an optical delusion of consciousness, wow. So if that's where we're going, if that's the story we're telling, well, then the only solution is Thanos, right? But if we tell a new story, well, what do it mean to tell a new story of value where if you're an up-and-coming data scientist, you actually want to go work on the World Hunger Project. You want to work on, right, a new form of microfinancing, right? You want to work on, right, new forms of, right, education, right? You want to work on actually using the techplex to generate new forms of individuated, unique self-education and transformation that shock reality and introduce, right, a unique self-utopia that's been unimaginable in history. We're only going to do that if we actually create a new sense of vision, of virtue, right? A new sense of courage, a new sense of nobility, where we're called to be knights at the new round table. We're called to go on a noble quest, where it seems ridiculous to us to actually go and make $800,000 at Microsoft, right? What an utter waste of a lifetime. Where I can take my technoplex creativity, right, and apply it, right, to the transformation of reality. When we create a motivational architecture of nobility and honor and value, then we want to participate in that nobility and honor and value. So you begin to see it. So in that new motivational architecture, at the very center is the irreducible dignity of every human story, right? Not just the therapeutic dignity, right? But what underlies the original impulse of therapy, which is that story matters. And that story is not just reorganizing the pastoral that needs to be done. It's the fullness of presence in the present And it's that unique self responding creatively and giving their unique gift to the call of the future. Oh my God, right? So wow, that's what an evolutionary spirituality needs to look like, where I'm an evolutionary unique self. I'm Homo sapien who's evolved and become a new human and a new humanity, Homo amor. I'm the universal love story in person, creatively playing my instrument in unique self symphony, right, as we're omni-considerate, right, for the sake of the whole. Wow, that's the vision. That's wildly exciting.